Hello and welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about bosses in video games. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what we do on this podcast?
Well, it is pretty simple. We like to talk about games. But before we get into our illustrious topic, we should recap what happened in our games this week. At the time of recording, we just played Rune Lords. So there's actually going to be a different Rune... You know what I mean? Like, there's going to be a different Rune Lords episode up by the time this episode goes out, right?
Right, yeah.
So,
yes.
Well, whatever the case may be, we broke into the keep, fighting dudes. If you watch, you'll see lots of full attacks from Kenzo, because I just was tanking all of the mooks while you guys were dealing with the mini boss.
Yeah, I've burned through almost all of my spells as Wind Wanderer at this point, which is the only time I've ever even come close to that. And I'm not even like a character who I'm playing a battle oracle who doesn't uses spells mostly for self buffs. But yeah.
Yeah, I've actually held on to a lot of my resources, which is to say challenges, because that's basically my only non-renewing resource.
Yeah, I've burned most of my spells in healing for the party.
Yeah, I guess I weirdly feel like we do dungeons, but we don't do them very often. So like dungeoneering play isn't something that I think about in the or maybe that's just the tournament is kind of getting in my head, because the tournament was just, here's one fight, blow everything.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And then what else did we do? Well, so last week
Rebels.
we also did Hell's Rebels, which is up now. Is it up now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I uploaded it.
That Hell's Rebels episode was interesting because I was just stalling as hard as I could to try, because one of our players, we were supposed to do combat finally, and one of our players was stuck at work, so I was just trying to stall for him. And we are now four episodes straight, no combat.
But we got to meet Ralph.
You did get to meet Ralph, who is great. That was completely on the fly. You
know what? It was perfect. Actually, no, it was almost perfect. He just refused to refer to Mateo by his proper name. But I can forgive
you can't win them all.
You
can't win them all. I really enjoy Ralph. I really enjoy Mateo and Ralph and all of these kinds of guys. But it's funny because I don't really think, I knew there was going to be like this little bit with Ralph, but I don't necessarily think of him being all that major, which is why I didn't really put any time or effort into figuring out his personality besides just randomly go with it when it happens.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of what Ralph has always been. Ralph, for the listeners rather at home, being Mike. So a lot of the side characters in Hell's Rebels are RPCs from a Skull and Shackles campaign that got abandoned. And so Ralph was my character, and Buddy did him a great service in being just an angry.
I just can't wait. I just can't wait for stuff to happen in that game.
Yeah,
because I can't wait for stuff I can't wait for you guys to get all of the people together and have I like because I have very set personalities for kind of who Taylor is, who Mateo is, kind of thing, and I'm interested to see where you guys fall down along those kinds of lines. When a problem comes up and arguments erupt. Where ideologically your characters come down interests me. But we still got a little bit of time, because you guys have to rescue Mateo and figure out where Vigo is.
So are we just going to gather a bunch of people and maybe do a couple of missions to get them in our good graces, and then have one big mission that kind of, does all the plot in this campaign before we move on to Mass Effect 3?
There's definitely a little bit of that. I have there's stuff involved, but I think it's a big thing because I want there to be a lot of kind of I think that this actually was handled pretty well by you guys, which I think is good. Like, there should be tension about the decisions that you guys are making, right? About, like, well, where is the best place for us to have this safe house? Do we want to go forward with Mission X when we know it's useful, but we're afraid of the notoriety that's going to come with it, kind of thing. I think those arguments are going to be pretty cool, pretty informative. I think there's some other stuff that's kind of like this down the line. That's just like these are the moments that I'm really looking forward to when it comes to Hell's Rebels. Though we're off this week and we're playing more Shadowrun, which I guess I'm always excited for.
Yeah, no, I'm excited for all of the games we are playing. But yeah, do you want to say anything else about Hell's Rebels?
Yeah, man. What do I want to say? Anything? I guess not. Right?
Yeah,
we are finally going to get into combat. I'm really excited for that.
Yeah.
I'm actually, to be honest, I'm really excited. I recently redesigned an encounter. Because I decided to be awesome and do some things differently. And I'm really happy with that. So, I'm just excited for Hell's Rebels. Yeah. But anyway, boss fights, video games.
Just one point of, or just, we can still do our weeks in video games. Also, one piece of housekeeping. We are going to shoot to release this cast on Tuesdays. What's the word I want to use? Consistently. Instead of the kind of hodgepodge of once a week, I promise, guys, that I've been doing in the past. So we record on Tuesdays and release on the next Tuesday. So don't expect any particularly up to topic or up to moment stuff out of this. But that's the way it's gonna go. But did you do anything interesting in video games this week besides play lots of League of Legends? Which I know
not really. I've just been grinding League really hard. I got back into Minecraft. I'm playing Minecraft again. They released update 1.9, which actually introduced some interesting combat mechanics to the game. I know, right?
How has post Mojang Minecraft been?
Well, it's still technically run by everybody at Mojang. They're just under the Microsoft banner,
except for Notch.
Yeah, except for Notch. But to be honest, that's kind of normal because Notch hasn't run Minecraft in a couple of years anyway.
Right.
So things have been. I can't remember what the guy's name was. I was a big fan of 1.8, and I do really enjoy 1.9 so far from kind of like what I've seen of it because the combat feels more interesting and fair. Swords. So basically, the changes that they made are. Everything has an attack speed, so if you spam the sword button, right, and you're constantly swinging, everything has an attack speed, and then swords and axes have specific special attacks. Those special attacks trigger when you wait the appropriate amount of attack speed, right? So for I have this diamond axe, and the diamond axe has a 0.9 attack speed, so I have to wait 0.9 of a second in order to re-trigger the crushing blow ability of the axe, which just does like way more damage than otherwise, beat sticking somebody with by spamming the axe button. And so what ends up happening is you're timing your attacks a lot. Because you want to, you want to make sure you get your special hit in because you're going to do 9 hearts worth of damage rather than the spam hit, which is going to do half a heart worth of damage. They also added shields, which are awesome, and they changed, they changed some other stuff around.
Do you get like a cooldown timer? Like you get like a little cooldown bar?
No, you just kind of like internally figure it out because the animations play differently. Like,
sure,
you can tell by what the animations are. Swords have like a sweep attack that sweeps, and it'll hit everybody in front of you, kind of thing. I've been blown up by some creepers that are just like that's probably one of the most frustrating things about Minecraft, right? It's just like creeper out of fucking nowhere blows you up and you go all the way back to kind of like the start point.
Unless you've made like the thing, you can reset your spawn point, right? With like a
a bed, but like I just hadn't had a bed. I once had a really unfortunate. I had the most unfortunate thing happen, which was I went to go sleep in my bed, and then when I woke up, a creeper had spawned right outside. So it walked into the house where my bed was, and it blew up me and my bed, which reset my spawn point all the way back. It gave me the hardest fucking cancer.
And then you quit
my
Minecraft
God.
until yesterday.
Yeah. And then, they've also changed the way, like, hunger and stuff works, which is kind of neat. Hunger and, like you regenerate HP really, really quickly, but, like, it consumes hunger more. I don't know. It's weird. Minecraft is interesting. But, yes, grindy video games that I play while watching House of Cards is Minecraft this week.
Huh. Well,
Oh, and
this week-
Street Fighter, even though I'm really bad at that.
Oh, you
I haven't
have been playing.
I haven't actually played any like ranked or anything like that. I've just been like training with Dawson and playing like shitty little games with Dawson. I'm so bad at Street Fighter.
You should turn on casual matches or at least try a couple of them just to see how it pans out. Maybe we should do some exhibition matches before we go into our big day against the Unwise Index.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested because I don't really know all that much about Street Fighter. Most of my fighting game experience comes from Soul Calibur 2, and Soul Calibur 2 is just so radically different a game because it's technically like a 3D fighter, like 2.5D or whatever.
It's an arena fighter, whereas Street Fighter's a 2D fighter. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is just like a huge difference, because I really like Soul Calibur 2. I think Soul Calibur 2 is really well designed, really great, right? Soul Calibur 2, you have horizontal attacks, vertical attacks, and kicks, and then guards, right? Those are the 4 face buttons on a controller, and because you can strafe, right? You can move side to side because it's 3D or whatever in the arena. Vertical attacks are very strong but easy to dodge. Horizontal attacks are pretty weak but easy to hit, and then kicks are like almost a smattering of the two because some of them are horizontal, some of them are vertical, but the vast majority of them are really, really quick. So you can like get people off guard with like quicks in order to like start your combos and stuff like that. And I think that's really, that's a fundamentally really like interesting design. But because Street Fighter is 2D, like the top, medium, low aspect of it is just like a really weird mindset for me to be in. And the biggest thing is like moving back in order to guard, in order to
block,
in order to block is so weird. I have such a hard time with it.
Yeah, I mean it's actually a super big thing actually in the community because famously Mortal Kombat has a block button specifically because Street Fighter didn't when it started, and that's just kind of a tradition that kind of got carried forward. But it really affects the way you play the game because if you want to be safe while not moving backwards, you crouch block, but then you're open to overheads, which aren't universal, or rather, jump attacks universal. But it introduces a lot of different things into the game, especially for things like charge characters, where that's the only way they can charge their moves without moving backwards, type of deal. There's a lot. There's a whole lot of nuance in those systems that even I'm not super.
And honestly, I do find that really interesting because Mortal Kombat has such a shallow move list compared to what I'm expecting.
Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter?
Street Fighter 5.
Okay.
The move list on characters like Dhalsim is absolutely dwarfed by, Aquaman in Injustice: Gods Among Us, which is probably like the most recent fighting game besides Mortal Kombat I've like hard played. Or Mitsurugi, who is my character in Soul Calibur 2. You just had so many more moves at your disposal. But also at the same time, like I like the Mortal Kombat system better because there's a lot of
Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter?
I mean, Street Fighter. I like the Street Fighter system better because there's a lot less like it's a little bit more like Super Smash Brothers, where it's you're cutting out the wheat for the chaff kind of thing, right? Like it's easy to the characters are easier to understand, and you kind of understand what's going on compared to what it's like in Soul Calibur, where I kind of think the burden of knowledge is almost a little bit higher because you have to know what each of these characters.
Yeah. Also, it's a little bit different too because if I remember correctly, a lot of Soul Calibur special moves are like weird kind of target combos, which are kind of categorized differently than in Street Fighter. I think Street Fighter also has a lot more.
What do you mean by I don't know what a target combo means.
Oh, so a target combo is a specific combo set up by the game that's just like a string of normals. And Street Fighter,
Okay.
I think, has a higher emphasis on normals and footsies. Footsies being, kind of edging out and getting ranges perfect, that type of play.
Yeah.
Than the other game. But I'm also not a big Soul Calibur player, so feel free to tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't played Soul Calibur 2 in 10 years. So I'm like, my mindset is probably warped by the time it has taken for like the games to kind of come in and change and stuff like that. But I am that's Street Fighter. That's also something I've been playing, I guess.
Awesome. I look forward to you being good enough that we can get some spars on. That'll be great. So what I've been playing is I beat the only big thing to mention is I beat Ori and the Blind Forest on Sunday, which is a really cool little Metroidvania, gorgeous looking. I had some issues with some of the story elements. I thought there's a couple moments that I don't want to really spoil it for anybody, so I won't go too deep into it. But I thought some of the character motivations seemed awkward after there's a reveal, maybe 2/3 of the way through. But it's a solid game. It's
how long did it take you to beat?
Let me check. I think it was like 7 hours. And I did most of that on Saturday because I'm a crazy person that binges things. Let me get it up on my Steam. Ori and the Blind Forest, 9 hours. So that's it, and I did a fairly complete run. One thing that really bothered me is there are a couple of areas that they're essentially like they're some like dungeon type areas, and once you beat them, you can't go back into them. And I didn't know that for the first one. And also, they have kind of some of these time sequences, and one of them has like collectibles along the time sequence that you can't go back to once you've beaten it. So I just thought that was terrible, and it really frustrated me. Because I missed 2 of the collectibles, and I think that's the only thing those are the only 2 collectibles I missed because I was going for a completionist type run. But
that sucks. Yeah, maybe yeah. I really, I had a poor experience with my first sitting in Undertale, which kind of like never, and I just had like yet to go back to it. I should probably, I should probably go back into that. But a game like Ori and the Blind Forest is, it's like that's a Saturday. I could just sit down and play that instead of fucking like grinding Minecraft like an idiot.
I mean, you could also do the same. You could do the same thing with Undertale. It's probably
that's what I mean. That's why I'm comparing the two.
Yeah.
Is like that nature.
On that note, I'll send you a video and I'll link it in the description for the viewers. Let me actually write this down so I don't forget again. There's a video that kind of captures how I feel. So your complaint with Undertale, I believe, was that you didn't like something about the foreseeability of the consequences when you were fighting Toriel. It's early enough that I don't think it really counts as a spoiler. And this video by a guy named Dookie Shed, which sounds whatever, but he goes into this bit about how when he first played the game, he played it like very early on the cusp before all the hype train started. And so because he didn't know about all this pacifist run, genocide run hoopla, he just kind of played the game, and because he didn't know that that's what was supposed to, that you could go for a pacifist run, his experience with fighting Toriel was super impactful, especially as someone who had played JRPGs in the past, where a fight against the mentor character typically ends with a kind of hi, good job, you beat me, and then they don't die type of deal. And obviously that's very different for the Toriel fight.
I think because I was coming into it after the cusp, as after the big break, and it beat the game, it beat Pokemon Red and Super Mario 64 on the GameFAQs best game of all time bullshit, that kind of stuff. I went in there with certain misconceptions, and that was part of the frustration of the whole thing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's actually an interesting part of how those kinds of games are designed, right? Because I feel like there are these for games like this with essentially the pacifist and the genocide endings are kind of secret endings, the way at least I view those types of games are supposed to work are you play through your first time kind of raw, and so long as the game kind of holds up for that playthrough, it's fine, and it's okay to be a little bit more frustrating on these kind of achievement-based runs, which is what a pacifist or a genocide run would be. Like a run with extra kind of things tacked on, with extra conditions tacked onto it. I think trying to play the game as a pacifist run as native run, which is what I did, but I guess I was able to look past the kind of spoils the or poisons the fruit of the tree, as it were, something like that.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. But I don't know.
Toriel is in fact a boss fight, and that's the topic for this week. Segways, we got those.
Ironically, I actually kind of think that she's a good launching point to talk about boss fights, because I'm just going to kind of go on record that I think boss fights in video games are more often than not handled poorly rather than handled well.
Huh. Well,
I think they're just on face, they're just shitty.
Huh.
Because here's kind of why. I think the vast majority of boss fights, what it comes down to is you don't want to give the players I think the hypothetical best case scenario with the boss fight is you are testing from a skills kind of point of view, mastery of mechanics for the player, right? And it's the hardest version of those mechanics. But what tends to happen in most boss fights in most video games is that completely new mechanics are created to justify or be that boss fight. You know what I mean? Which is I think that's just a huge problem for most. I don't know. I think it's just a huge problem for most games where they create systems that aren't well communicated or aren't all. It's about figuring out the gimmick, and then as soon as you figure out the gimmick, you beat the boss, and that's just kind of whatever, and it's easy. But it has almost nothing to do with all of the work that you've done leading up to that, right? You want Luke Skywalker to get better and better at fighting with lightsabers, but then the boss fight, to use this analogy, is he and Darth Vader have a shoot-off with laser pistols, where it's we just want, you know what I mean? We just trained Luke to be so good at lightsaber fights, but then the boss fight is just completely contrived to be laser guns. What?
Or the boss fight is a successful diplomatic encounter with the Emperor.
Right. I mean, that kind of stuff. And this is purely speaking from a systems perspective. From a narrative perspective, there's just a lot more leeway that goes into this kind of stuff. But just this is the problem I see mechanically with boss fights, right? And that not a ton of games really do it. Right.
I'm not going to go my immediate reaction is to be most. That sounds weird, but that point's ultimately important, because I do think that it's even if it's not most, it is a problem that affects a lot of games. And I kind of see your point. The example in my mind that I jumped to immediately is Bowser in the original Super Mario Brothers operates on a complete. I guess it actually kind of operates on the same set of principles. You just replace the flagpole with the axe underneath Bowser, but it's still kind of that break from this is an enemy and you can't jump on his heads, and the way you beat him is you skip him. In most cases,
I think probably the best crystallization of this is Deus Ex Human Revolution, which has gotten. Because it honestly shows both sides. The first side is the boss fights are they're just complete bullshit in the standard edition of the game, which later revealed to be
outsourced.
They were outsourced to another studio, but then Eidos came back and took it over and fixed it for the director's cut, for the augmented edition. And those augmented edition boss fights feel great, right? Because if you're a stealth character, you can hide from people. If you're a hacker, you can hack into. This was the awesome part, was that if you're a hacking character, you can hack into the like turrets and just like mow down these bosses with turrets, which I think is great.
Yeah, and even kind of like you said, it's even in the standard edition, right? Like if you were playing a guns blazing type of character, those boss fights were kind of like the pinnacle of your ability to kind of do that gameplay. But if you weren't playing that, you were playing a stealth playthrough, they weren't. So kind of hit both of those points simultaneously. Right?
This is getting a little bit nitpicky, but I just kind of want to make the point. Even on the guns blazing playthrough, I don't actually think that they're all that interesting or compelling, right? Because they're just bullet sponges at that point, right? I think a guns blazing playthrough boss fight hypothetically pits like a ton of enemies against you, right? Because this is what the gunplay in Deus Ex is about. It's it's that kind of stop and poppy, taking cover, moving around, not getting flanked by these enemies. But when you're just fighting the one boss, it's actually relatively easy to. This I think is by design so that the stealth characters you play who don't have any like gun skills or whatever can still like eke out a win, kind of thing. But yeah, anyway, that point's really nitpicky. But
actually, I think that's kind of important, because the other part of your statement I was going to kind of get into was, you introduced a lot of these new mechanics just for the boss. And I think in some places that works, because at some level, if it's just a harder version of the thing you already done, it feels kind of dull, right? Like if it's just a big old bullet sponge, it teaches, and you've been getting better at shooting things real good, that, you're just shooting things real good for a while longer against a bigger enemy, and that's kind of like the crux of what you've been learning. But that gets boring fast, so lots of devs try and introduce different mechanics into the fight to make it more compelling. And I think that there are good ways to do that. I think there are poor ways to do that. I think something that you've highlighted, which is fair, is that a lot of times it's not done well, and it feels kind of like a something tacked on to the end. Is what I think.
I will say that my favorite game of all time, Mass Effect 2, I think does do that pretty well, because a lot of the boss fights are tough enemies coupled with like swarms, which like the game has a lot to do with, here's a group of guys, use your cover mechanics, use your allies in order to strip their armor, strip their shields, use your abilities, those kinds of things. And a lot of the times the boss fights in Mass Effect were those same groups, but with a more powerful leader who has who has one or two like off mechanics, right? Which I kind of think is a good version. It's a better version of that, because what is that in that specific situation? It's not saying, okay, we're not just going to replace the lightsaber duel with a laser pistol fight. You're still going to be lightsaber dueling, but you also have a laser pistol in your other hand, and you have to manage that system at the same time as you're managing the core system, which I think is a good compromise. In regards to like that whole breakdown.
I see that. I actually found the final boss of Mass Effect 2 to be fairly odious. I did not like.
So the final boss, I agree. But most of the boss fights that happen in between those missions, right, when you're fighting these boss, mercenary leaders or some of those other kinds of things, there are always these ads that you're managing. There's also, and to be honest, Mass Effect 2 is a big game. There's a lot of boss fights. Some of them, there's the one where you fight the airship in the apartment building. That one doesn't have any ads in it, or actually it does have ads now that I think about it. But whatever the case may be.
So all the fights actually, this is actually something that I was going to bring up, is that the fights have to have ads because you need to be able to replenish ammo if you run out of it.
Oh yeah, I guess that's true. No, that's actually clever. I never thought about that.
If you look for it, you'll see it in a lot of games with ammo systems. They have ads or some way to refill your ammo. You need some way to refill your ammo system, and usually that's ads that drop ammo.
Yeah, that makes sense. But that's just one way, I think, to kind of get around this problem. I think another way to get around this problem is to kind of systemize, around it with by almost like leaning into it. I think WoW bosses are kind of a good example of this, where it's like, yeah, they're creating, each individual boss is creating new systems in order to defeat it, but that's the point. Which is what, like WoW bosses kind of have like, in a weird way, they are less like the Deus Ex example and more like the Mass Effect example, because WoW bosses are kind of, but much more on the new system side, because WoW bosses are basically like, okay, here, listen, this is your rotation. Your rotation is fairly simple, and we're going to put you in a bunch of different environments where you have to constantly do your rotation, but at the same time deal with all of these extra new mechanics that are coming in and coming out, and you have to position correctly, and you have to manage phases, and you have to work with your team and not take raid damage, and use your cooldowns efficiently, those kinds of things that kind of make up for it, I think.
Yeah, I think part of that is with WoW in particular, with a lot of MMOs, is that the regular combat isn't particularly like there's very little mastery, I think, in the basic combat. Like, there's not, like, the raid bosses are kind of just, like, the thing that you do, right? Like, they are like, all of the content within themselves, that or the PvP, which are kind of two separate arenas, of gameplay for WoW in particular, and I think also most target MMOs. And so I think you're right on that point, but I think for the same kind of reasons, I don't know. I never found that content to be particularly compelling to me. I think my own problems with tab targeted MMOs in the first place is that I don't find them particularly compelling, and so I find the bosses just kind of like, well, in order to make this interesting, you have to do something weird, that kind of like rehearsal of a set fight isn't so compelling to me for a massively multiplayer, potentially, multiple run experience. Because at the end of the day, that's what MMOs are about. It's about running the content repeatedly to get your new numbers and make those numbers nice and big.
Yeah, I also think a big part of it with stuff like WoW is community based. I think it feels so much better to raid with to raid with a group of people who you raid with on a ranking. You know what I mean? It's like practicing. You know what I mean? It's like Little League almost, but like for adults and
recreation sports. Yeah, I get that.
Right. And so I think that piece of it also kind of like diffuses. It's not quite the same beast as fighting bosses in Mass Effect 2 or in Super Mario, which are these single player experiences. I also think that narratively, WoW is a little bit weirder, just like because it is. WoW is kind of an interesting game that like lives on the line of like as art as sports kind of thing, because it's so expansive that there's a lot of both content in there. But a lot of those raids can be kind of qualified in the sports category, especially after time goes down. The first time I got to the Lich King, the first time I beat the Lich King, that was a really powerful like narrative experience for like me, because because of the whole expansion, setting it up and it being such a satisfying climax to that playing Wrath of the Lich King. But when I had the Lich King on farm and we were doing him for the 25th time, the narrative weight there just doesn't carry, and it becomes much more about the sport. It becomes about, can I beat my numbers? Can we beat our numbers as a group? How, can we one shot him? Do we have to dedicate a full night kind of thing? That stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know if I've got really anything to contribute on that front other than, that's... MMOs are an interesting place with boss design, because I think in most games, like you said, they're there to show off mastery of particular mechanics. They're there to show off, in, say, JRPGs, like how many stats you've accumulated. They're there to show off, kind of the accumulation of your training, whereas in MMOs, they're there to... essentially be roadblocks to gearing up. I just think it's a very weird dynamic. as compared to other games.
I mean, I also think that certain boss fights are better than others, just like
sure,
design wise. I really like. There's a boss fight in Warlords of Draenor called Twin Ogron that I just think is great. I just really enjoy this boss fight because the fundamental mechanic is there are just these like random snaking bits of fire that add like fire damage, and they're just like they're moving in waves and like pulsing all across the floor, but there's so many of them that you have to kind of like dodge between them. And have you ever seen the movie Ocean's 12?
Yeah.
So you know the part where George Clooney and Julia Roberts are like, oh, well, how did you beat the fucking laser system? And the French thief is there, and he just kind of like smirks, and then it cuts to, just like does this smash cut to him in this dance montage where he's like breakdancing through the lasers. That is exactly how I feel about dodging those that fire on Twin Ogron. And you almost get into like you get into like this Zen state of just like moving and weaving, and you're doing your rotation, and it's all like just kind of happening on like a primal muscle memory level that I don't know. I can't really define it.
No,
that is so fun to me.
That's actually I understand that perfectly. That's like in a lot of like say character action games, or in a lot of platformers, super tough platformers where I guess a lot of the levels are bosses, I suppose. That kind of like, like, and then I do then an A, and then a B, and then I jump here, and then I'm going to hit this button 3 times, and that'll get me to the right place, and then, that kind of like training to perfection aspect that's critical in a lot of, in a lot of games. And that also takes place in boss fights. Ori and the Blind Forest, there's it's not really a fight, it's more of a chase sequence. A boss chase sequence, and it very much falls in that kind of like, oh, in order to dodge this, I have to jump up here, and I have to make sure to hit it just here, otherwise I'm going to run out of time, I'm not going to be able to complete this move type of deal, which I think feeds into the same kind of like satisfaction loop.
Yeah, I'm all about that satisfaction loop.
Is Twin Ogron's from the first raid in Draenor?
Yeah, hi Maul.
Okay, and do those flames show up on the tourist mode, or whatever it's called?
Yeah.
Okay.
LFR.
Okay, yeah, because I remember doing that fight. I remember finding it extremely dull, because as a monk, I just put my clones on the 2 bosses and just kind of like went and slapped about. That worked out for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that's obviously like.
That's a breakdown by role.
Me playing a warrior, you playing a monk. I played that fight as a healer on my priest, and it is much more aggravating because when you're a priest, you know what I mean, you want to sit still and channel your casts, and so the constantly having to move and dodge isn't fulfilling like it is on the warrior, where I don't have any of those kinds of casts. So I am. Like, I never rooted in that one place. I don't know. That's just...
No, that's fair.
It's just, yeah. But yeah, I guess that's part of it. I mean, there's also fights that I find incredibly aggravating as a warrior because, people are just like, certain bosses, Terran Gore in Hellfire Citadel just sits there. He doesn't move or anything, so it is really just,
Yeah,
how quickly, how fast can I do my rotation? But on my Warlock, it's a lot more interesting because it's the ranged job to DPS down the ads. I don't know. There's lots of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of issue. Well, maybe not the issue, but the difficulty in designing a boss for an MMO where you've got several distinct classes of like not even like not classes in like the your character classes, but classes of role, like roles. That's the word I'm looking for. Sorry.
Right.
And so you're not. I think it's hard to hit the mark on all of them, all the time. But that doesn't mean you can't be aggravated about certain ones. But that's MMO bosses, which, like I said, have a kind of unique position. But before we started the cast, we were kind of trying to solicit some feedback from some of our friends, and our one friend of the show, Enoch, was talking about how his favorite boss type was two-phase JRPG bosses, because he loved that, like, you could tell that, like, you were facing this big guy, because there was big signal that you transitioned into, like, this, you know, like the man behind the man, or, like, you know, the true form of the boss, which had a totally different set of things to do and a totally different set of things to get with. And that you usually lost that fight the first time you fought it, and that signaled to you that you needed to go train up some more, which I guess kind of rolls back into our discussion about grinding a couple episodes ago. But you mentioned that you didn't like that very much.
Yeah, I think that's bullshit, basically. I don't know. I thought about it a little bit more after. I thought a little bit more afterwards. I think sometimes it's okay in the Pokemon games, specifically. There's, you know, so, like, I think there's a certain aspect to it where, like, you know, when you're playing Pokemon and you're training up your team and you get to the Elite Four, nobody beats the Elite Four on the first pass, right? You have to grind the Elite Four, and to a certain extent, there's a lot of, like, it feels really good to beat them, right? And it feels really good to make it all the way through the Elite Four without, you know, like, after however many times of wiping. And it's like two sides of the same coin as with the WoW stuff to a certain extent. Like, it feels really good to, like, eke out a win at, like, the 1% mark when half the raid is already dead, you know, and you and everybody else are doing everything you can to possibly win. This happened in Wrath of the Lich King with my progression raid group when we did Professor Putricide. I was a tank at the time, and we had been wiping on Professor Putricide for two and a half weeks straight, and it was our last raid day of our third raid week, and it was, like, so demoralizing because it was just wiping. And what eventually ended up happening is we got him down to the 1% mark, but we had hit the enrage timer on the boss because a bunch of people had died or whatever. So even though, like, the healers were keeping people up and everything like that, we just, like, didn't have the DPS. So what had happened was he enraged, and there are two tanks, right? He enraged. He's on the first tank. As he's going to kill the first tank and go to the rest of the party, I as a warrior went and I intercepted his attack, so I get one shot. The other tank gets one shot. One of the healers gets one shot, and then the boss goes down. And, you know, that feels so good, right? That feels so good when you just, like, you know, like, on the edge of defeat, right? You snatch that victory kind of thing. And I think that also happens to a certain extent in JRPGs, but also at the same time, it just doesn't happen sometimes. You know, sometimes that feeling doesn't translate, and it is just, oh, how fucking frustrating is this thing? It keeps, you know, I just keep failing, and it's not my fault. It's just I haven't I just don't grind enough stats in order to get there. It's just like, it's such bullshit. I think it's like two sides of the same coin.
I think that's part of the danger of games that are purely stat based, right? Like any type of what effectively is going to be like a turn based like turn based game with no arena mechanics like a JRPG has. I think that's a huge deal, because, like, it's like I think, like, a great boss battle is one that pushes you to your limit, and then kind of you know, and when you like you said, when you beat it, it's just like, oh, I just barely eked that out. But the whole core progression of a JRPG is that you play it enough, and you get enough numbers that you can win. And yeah, you can play the game in the style that, like, you can just get enough numbers to just barely eke out a victory, and that can feel good. But the way that those games are structured is that you're, like, you know, you could just grind out for some longer and then roll over the boss fight as if it were nothing. And that's kind of like a core part of the feedback loop for that game style is getting more numbers to you know, be the best at numbers and win by overwhelming force in that regard. And I think that's a very, very hard thing to balance. I think it's a very hard thing to pull off. In general, right? Like, for games with advancement. Because I feel like something like auto-adjusted levels like you have in your Bethesda games also feel like they're robbing you, because it's, why am I bothering advancing if everything's kind of at the level that I expect it to be at, or like at my level?
Yeah, and I think, and this is why I think that, you know, most boss fights in most games are not great, is because of that, the latter half thing that you just highlighted, right? Which is that boss fights can just feel like you're completely contrived in that way, and that is frustrating. I don't know. I have a tough time. I have a tough time with it. I also think there are really good examples of games that handle boss fights well. I think the best example is Shadows of Mordor, Middle-earth Shadows of Mordor. That whole Nemesis system is a gigantic system for boss fights, right? But it's so good. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely.
I don't think that I secretly don't think that system gets like as much praise as it deserves. I think Shadow of Mordor really came out of the woodwork. It was on a lot of best of 2014 lists. It really went. It kind of like really went nuts for the year it was in. It was definitely in my top like 3-ish. 3, yeah, 3 is fine. Wait, let me think. I think Banner Saga was that year, which I think was my game of the year that year. Banner Saga, Dragon Age Inquisition, and then yeah, that's fair. Anyway,
it was in before times, before the cast, an age shrouded in mystery.
Yeah, the before time. I actually think, anyway, I think and so I think that Nemesis system is so good.
I agree. So I thought it was amazing.
Because I think it's crazy to me that it's procedural, and it's crazy to me how good the procedural was, like the procedural generation was, right? Like learning about your targets, right? Learning about your marks and understanding how you can exploit their weaknesses, strategize around their strengths in order to beat them is obscene. It's incredible to me that they made that system and they made it as good as they did. I honestly like. I literally bought the Mad Max game in September. I was like sick for 2 days in September, and I really liked Mad Max Fury Road, and I was just sitting there and I was like, you know what? It's the same guys who made fucking Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor. I'm just gonna go for it. I'm not gonna give a fuck. And the game was a little bit, the game was a little bit like sandbox grindy, and it was a lot about like these kinds of driving mechanics that I think are probably interesting to some people, but really not all that interesting to me. But like I bought that game because of how good this one system was in this one other game from last year, 2 years ago, I guess at this point.
Yeah, no, and I think kind of pile on top of that, there are also some very good bosses in games from a more narrative perspective. I think that the Metal Gear Solid series is legendary for having excellent boss sequences, and I think that they handle those very well. These kind of like very kind of they're an example of new mechanics for new situations type of bosses, but that's like what that game is all about, kind of. Kind of like this gradual buildup of different tools in your toolbox that you use to solve the various and sundry problems. But like the sheer, like the number of ways that you can beat certain bosses, like the level of intricate crafting given, and especially in regards to Metal Gear Solid, the narrative weights of each of the bosses, I think really comes together to build some really memorable encounters. My personal favorite being that in Metal Gear Solid 3, I believe he's called The End. Forgive me if I got that wrong, but he's this old man sniper. And it's this long drawn out sniper battle. And if he gets you, he will just he won't kill you. He'll knock you out and carry you back to a point, and you have to go back to the fight area. But if you turn off your console for 7 days, he dies of old age. And you find his body, and it's like he was disappointed that he didn't get the shot, like he didn't get to die in combat or like a warrior or something like that, like in very Kojima-esque way, and I always thought that was incredible storytelling. And kind of the other half of that is that you can also kill him very early in the game. Somebody's wheeling him away on a dock in the distance, and you could shoot him right there. And then that fight just doesn't happen later. And I thought that's a very those are some very good pieces of design. The way that those individual mechanics, even though they're unique, just are unique or are kind of like these separate tests, are unique enough that it kind of feels good. Another example being Psycho Mantis in the first game, where he can read your inputs unless you plug a controller into what you're supposed to do is you plug a controller into the second controller port, and then you can just fight out like normal. Always thought that was super cool. And these kinds of like individual story elements work really well to deliver a very memorable experience, which is ultimately, I think, what every boss fight wants to be, is a memorable piece of the game that you're playing. An incredible, feeling of accomplishment when you do it, and a kind of like walk away from it is like, wow, that was a thing that happened, type of deal.
Yeah, I've never played the Metal Gears, so I'm just gonna have to take your word for it, I guess. But I definitely understand that feeling. I definitely understand what you're getting at in terms of like finding that feeling in boss fights. And I specifically actually really enjoy systems. I enjoy systems like what you've just described, because I mostly think of how immersive they feel compared to I don't know. Yeah, because compared to systems where everything, you can't attack, or he's invincible, stuff like that. That's tough, right? That's tough.
Yeah.
I think this is the failing of a lot of boss fights and stuff like Fallout and Skyrim.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up legendary creatures in Fallout don't feel like this. Feel like slightly tougher regular enemies.
Yeah, that's yep. And I think that, jeez, I don't want to get back on the Fallout 4 hatred heroin.
It's been at least like a dozen episodes since we talked about Fallout 4.
I know, dude. As my good friend Doug Stamper would say, "Fuck the zero." But I think that is almost a little bit unfair to a certain extent. And I feel as though, maybe I should be a little bit more forgiving on this stuff, because the other parts of the games are so good. You know what I mean? Like, I don't really know how to feel about it. Like, from a business perspective, you know what I mean? Like, from a business perspective, the game can't be... it can't have everything, right? The Nemesis... Until the Nemesis system is, released in a way that you can just incorporate it into fucking everything... I maybe, I don't know, maybe like it's kind of unfair to hold that stuff to that standard. Really, I'm trying to kind of defend Skyrim in my own mind, because I think Skyrim is like truly, legitimately like one of like the great. I think it's the best game Bethesda's ever made. I think it is totally worthy of the pantheon of like the great games and
the canon of games, as it were.
Yeah, the canon of games. This is a good reference to a podcast that I talk about all the time. And I don't want it to have this fault, but I think it does have this fault. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just trying too hard to apologize for it.
Part of it is that no game is perfect, and it's all right for games to sometimes fail.
Actually, you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it more, I'm totally fucking wrong. I think Skyrim is great. I think Skyrim is really great, especially those dragon fights. All of those dragon fights.
I'm gonna have
the dragon priests. The dragon priests are awesome.
That game, like the boss fights or the dragon fights, stopped being interesting to me once they got, what was it? Like, there's a talent invocation where if you two-hand cast a spell, it stuns a creature, And
the staggering one, yeah,
and
that's fair.
that's that's how I kill dragons.
That is fair. See, my first playthrough was stealth and dual wielding one-handed weapons, which was very tough.
Stealth archery.
Yeah. Well, I actually didn't. I wasn't all that much about archery, but because stealth archery is kind of not great in Skyrim because it's really inefficient, like time wise. Which I kind of appreciate, right? Like the system wants you to get up there with a fucking dagger and just like dagger people. But basically, the way I had to do a lot of these dragon fights was wait for it to come to the ground and then power attack it a couple of times in a row and just like hope to God it didn't kill me. But I have done a full mage playthrough where I do agree the double stun.
Yeah,
sucks. But like I said, I also think the dragon priests are great fights. I think they're all very.
Are those the guys with the masks?
Yeah, I think those are all really interesting.
There's this is actually something I'm going to rip straight out of the Zero Punctuation video about Skyrim, which is a lot of the Skyrim fights to me felt kind of like figure out how to abuse the AI, like stand right outside the room and plank the overpowered boss that you can't toe-to-toe with in the head from outside the room, so he runs over to you and then resets because he doesn't know how to walk outside of the room he's in. And I don't think an enemy AI is a great strength of Skyrim, but I think
that's true. Actually, I do feel that. I feel that because I'm enough of a power gamer, like I'm enough of a Captain Crunch in Skyrim that I never really had like too much trouble with most stuff. Yeah.
I think I can agree with you though, because like I agree with you at a certain point, because this is another problem with like the fundamental advancement mechanics in RPGs is that like that first fight against the dragon outside of what town is it outside of Wilhelm? Whiterun. That feels amazing. And even if it's just a little bit chaotic and like whatever, but that fight feels like it's earned and feels like a great fight. And the later dragon fights and the later fights might kind of fall to this kind of like, well, whatever, I'm over, I'm OP now and the system hasn't scaled enough with me. But I think they hit it well enough on that first run to see where the intentions of the systems were. And I think this is a problem endemic to Bethesda games is they scale to a hypothetical average player, and players like us are just kind of too good for that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, actually, you know what? I 100% agree, because here's the thing. First of all, I think that first dragon fight was great, and then I actually kind of think the next couple, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
There's a period, there's a really, like, it's actually kind of a sizable sweet spot, just because of like in the scale of Skyrim games, like in the scale of a game like Skyrim, of which I had like 200 hours played or whatever, a section of 20 hours where every dragon fight was really compelling seems like not all that much time, but that's 20 hours, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, just like, and I think that feels great, but then eventually you kind of over-level the content. You've just done it enough times to a certain extent, right? Like, I've definitely had that happen where, like, the first time I fought, like, an ancient dragon, or, like, you know what I mean? Or, like, whatever, or, like, just gotten completely destroyed by like, just, like, one dragon or another that I've never seen before.
I actually think that's the fundamental problem with the Bethesda games is that I don't think the content scales well. I think it's a very fundamental kind of like you either lose hard to the content or you beat it handily.
I actually think that it scales. I think that it's pretty good in the beginning, like early to mid-game, it's great.
That's what I mean.
And then as you get later and later and later, it gets worse and worse and worse.
That's what I mean about the scaling factor, right? Like there's this desire that when you level up, you feel like you've accomplished something and things feel easier, right? Like defeating a dragon should feel easier at level 3 than it does at level 2. The issue is that it gets way too easy, in my opinion, a little bit too quickly. I think if all you did was just go hunt down dragons, you'd avoid a lot of that problem, but that was never my experience in Skyrim.
Yeah, my experience. I think another thing that really helped the Skyrim dragons work out is the emergent nature of it, right? Like a Skyrim just randomly spawning while you're like selling shit in Whiterun, and then you're trying to fight the dragon in the town, but it's like, you know what I mean? Like, but there's all of these guards there, so its aggro is distracted, and you're trying to. I'm specifically referencing one fight where I was in Riften, and not like a named, it was a named NPC, but it wasn't like a super important NPC. Like I'm pretty sure he didn't have like the unkillable aspect to him. Like he could have died. And I really remember how tense that dragon fight was, because I was trying so hard to make sure this quest NPC was kept alive. Right? And I think that kind of thing is also really interesting, right? I think the kind of dragon fights where dragons, come down and then a bear is there, you know what I mean? It's like, and so you're fighting the bear while the dragon is flying around, but you're trying to kite the bear into the dragon when the dragon lands. That stuff is really interesting. I don't know. I think that there's, man, I really love Skyrim. God, what a great game.
Actually, I agree with you entirely. I feel like there are a lot of those kind of emergent moments that happen in Skyrim, which kind of makes up for the fact that like some of these fights are not like. I think the kind of emergent moments that happen because of that overshadow the fact that the individual mechanics can get kind of rote at some point.
Yeah, and I think that's a good approach to sandbox design in general.
Yeah, sure.
Where it's a lot of simple systems that it's kind of like I feel like game design like this is just like trying to make as many like super bouncy balls, right? And what you're gonna and what your goal is to like drop them all into a sphere or whatever, and they're just gonna keep bouncing off of one another in cool, interesting ways, right? Such that each individual, if it was just one ball bouncing up and down, that would be really boring, kind of thing. But because it's just so chaotic and there's so many different systems at play, you get into you just like get into some really like cool, interesting scenarios that are like really fulfilling. This is kind of my experience with Dishonored, of all things, where I very notably am a little bit softer on Dishonored than you, because I think it's kind of an A- game compared to like an A+, or like a straight up A game kind of thing. But the thing that bugged me so much about Dishonored was I felt like the mechanics they had for killing people were so much more interesting than the mechanics they had for stealthing through stuff that game, like I almost felt a little bit robbed in that game, because I really wanted to stealth, right? But the stealthing stuff was just more boring for me than the kind of like wacky, crazy, here I'm gonna time stop and I'm going to plug a grenade or whatever, and then I'm gonna time all of these crossbow bolts and blinking all around. Like that stuff, that aspect of the gameplay was really engaging, and it was a lot of really fun, chaotic systems working with one another. But the stealth just didn't quite match that level for me.
I think that's fair. I think also that, like...
just to completely contextualize that, what ended up happening when I played Dishonored was I abandoned my stealth playthrough because I was so bored, and I just started killing people, and it was so much more fun.
See, I love
I got to the end.
See, I really loved the stealth playthrough in that game. Like, I don't know. Something about, like... So, something that bothered me about this game is kind of like a difficulty point, is that what bothered me is that the harder version of that game, just like the hard mode of that game, just increased the the sight cones, rather than like adding like extra guards or something.
Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah, I think that might be like talking about difficulty in games might be an episode in itself, and I wrote it down this time that way we won't forget.
Nice, well, way to go, dude. A little inside baseball. We have a hard time coming up with episode ideas sometimes, but it's weird because all the time we're always like, we should do a full episode on blankety blank.
We can never remember what blankety blank is.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe I should probably give Dishonored a second try. like a second run through, because I bet I would like it a little bit more. I think a big problem with Dishonored is I played it back to back with Deus Ex Human Revolution, if I remember correctly, and I think Human Revolution is like legitimately one of the best stealth games of all time. Because well, the thing that Human Revolution had that Dishonored didn't quite get to was the level ups being super impactful from a stealth perspective. I think most of this comes down to how good the blink spell is.
Yeah, that's fair.
In Dishonored, the first thing I ever did was I upgraded my blink spell, so I got like the more distance out of it, and I think if I had gone for some of the more quirky ones, if I had gone for Possession and Time Stop and that one where you can like go into like rat, I guess that is Possession, the one where like you can go into rats and shit like that. Maybe I would have had a better time with it, but because I had from the very get go that upgraded blink, it was a lot easier to traverse from place to place.
Yeah, no, it's something that Dishonored did very well was a super broad way to play. Like you could beat a level in a large variety of ways. And I thought that was awesome.
I think both games share that. I think both of them have really great level design. In that sense,
I thought Deus Ex had really good level design, but I didn't think it was like I felt like there were like, there was 2 to 3 ways to beat any particular Deus Ex segment, and they're like,
okay, I see.
Like I think there was like 6 or 7 ways to beat every Dishonored segment, and like you could use a variety of powers. The issue is that in order to kind of fully experience that, you need to play through the game multiple times, which is I think Deus Ex had I think Deus Ex and Dishonored both had like multiple pathing as far as the level design was concerned, but there was a little bit broader like kind of like goal options in Dishonored. I think this is just because a lot of that game is about the choice, you know what I mean, like choicey stuff. But Deus Ex really isn't about that stuff. It is kind of it's directed, railroaded story, and so there were a lot of paths to one goal. Where in Dishonored there were a lot of paths to a couple of different outcomes that made it, which I think is like the contributing factor there. That's absolutely fair. But
I really love those games. Jeez.
To get back to bosses, something I wanted to bring up before is like, the way you contrast, say, Skyrim-esque open world bosses, which by their necessity have to kind of just be a ball of increased stats that you can deal with your tools because they can't anticipate how you're doing things, to these kind of cultivated boss experiences that you can get in individual in games that are more linear. I think that there's some. There are good ways to do that too, and I think that there are good games there. And I had a game I wanted to go to, but I can't remember it because we talked about Dishonored for a while. Do you have any examples of that in particular while I remember what I was going to talk about?
I'm a little confused.
So, maybe Undertale's a good example of this. I'll go with Undertale because I like Undertale a lot. But like, part of the issue that we were discussing with Skyrim is that eventually kind of you outscale the content, but I think that kind of like, and that there are these emergent gameplay features. But I think part of because of that, because the game has to allow any character with any particular build to be able to overcome any sort of generalized challenge like the dragons are. Those dragons are prevented from being super interesting.
I think I see what you're saying.
Individually, because they have to be these generalized enemies that can be defeated by a variety of people. Whereas in a single, not a single player game, because Skyrim is also a single player game, but in a more directed experience, something like an Undertale, something like say Devil May Cry, even though I'm not particularly intimately familiar with those series. You can set up these boss fights that are particularly compelling because they have like a different set of mechanics, because they are a different set of kind of being, if that makes sense. Like, you can do interesting things with the fights because you know that everybody playing through that point will be approximately similar. And I wanted to bring up Undertale because every boss has some unique mechanics that really kind of shake up how the gameplay goes, which is, the central mechanic of, which I actually really like. The central mechanic of the game is that it's JRPG style combat, especially on the attacking. It's like there's a timing mini game, but on defense, you're a little heart inside of a box, and you have to dodge these little sprites. And every boss mixes that up somehow. Like in one of the early fights, instead of so your heart's usually free flying. You can just move freely around the box. It gives your box your heart or your heart gravity, so you're stuck to the bottom and you have to jump over obstacles. And in another one of the fights, instead of moving the heart, you have a shield that you use to deflect the projectiles that are coming in from a variety of directions, almost like a rhythm game. And I think that those types of experiences have the opportunity to be very, very memorable and very, very satisfying to beat, because you can cultivate that experience so close. And I think that that those types of designs, like really honing in on these like little mechanics, can really make a game super, super memorable and super great.
Okay, I think I agree with you. That makes sense. I'm trying to think of something that I could put in that category, but I'm kind of having a tough time coming up with something, because I think there are some. I think that so something that maybe this is kind of what I meant by this is a little bit of what I meant by the Mass Effect thing. I think Mass Effect kind of like operates along those levels, but not really in the same way. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of like pulling up. I'm kind of pulling up blanks on boss fights that I think would match that kind of experience. I guess maybe. I think that to a certain extent you can have boss fights that are about high level mastery of skills. So like, so for instance, in Guitar Hero 3 there are a couple quote unquote boss fights, right, where you play against actual guitarists, and when you play against Slash, Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine, and eventually the Devil in the super fucking awesome The Devil Went Down to Georgia, but like Guitar Hero version.
You get to fight Herman Lee for Dragon Force.
So.
Sorry,
there are fair enough. Whatever. There are some. There are some mechanics that are like a little bit different, but for the most part, like those boss fights are just, this is hard. This is tough. Also, a lot of those boss fights are completely new music. I think like a secret difficulty to those is that, like, okay, cool. You know what? When I'm playing Hit Me With Your Best Shot, I've heard that. I know the riff. It makes sense to me, but when I'm doing that Tom Morello fight, I've never done that riff before. And the ingenious one is on the Devil Went Down Georgia fight, where the regular kind of riff is the same, but it's embellished in a lot of the specifics are very, very different, which is nice because it like tricks you into thinking, like into this false sense of security almost, because you've heard that song, you know what that song is like, but this specific cover of it isn't that, and so you have to kind of like fight your instincts almost.
Yeah, no, that's. I think that plays into a lot of the mechanics these kind of fights try to go for, like the bread and butter that you're used to for however you get through needs, you need to tweak it slightly in order to get past this boss, or maybe you need to use more variety than you're used to. I'm drawing like a lot of character action type games. Like the most recent is going to date me, but the most recent one I've played is probably Wonderful 101. Has some sequences like that, which I thought is a fun game. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think boss fights in video games are interesting. I think narrative boss fights are also like a big deal, and some of them play out better or worse than others. I think that narratively, certain bosses can be like certain bosses can just be made or break by like the context of their. Borderlands 2 is a good example of this, where certain boss fights are interesting and fun and cool just because of the way they're introduced. You know what I mean? And like the personality that they have. And that's awesome. And I want more of that, I think. And I don't know. I really like.
Yeah, no. I think I agree with you. There are fights that are sold on their story aspect, even if the mechanics aren't so compelling.
I also like boss fights that lead to kind of interesting play. Assassin's Creed is a little bit of this, but like I like the boss fight that is like a gateway to like the next chunk of content almost. For instance, I mean, this is kind of the Assassin's Creed formula where you have to take, you have these targets, you have to take out these targets, and they give you information on your next targets, on where they're going, on where they're moving. And there's, I think overcoming those roadblocks in a boss fight scenario are fun and interesting as well. Yeah, I think that is certainly the case.
Yeah, I kind of wish I had a deeper, I'm kind of thinking about this now. Is that it's like why are we not drawing from a deeper pool of examples? It's like, oh, we've been playing League of Legends for the past 2 years all the time, and there are no.
Well, I also think that a certain sense of like boss fights aren't applicable to every game.
Right?
Actually,
Honestly,
I think boss fights are a little bit more applicable than we give them credit for. For instance, I think that there are quote unquote boss fights in strategy games all the time, right? Like when I'm playing Total War Attila. And I come to, this happens a lot when I'm playing in Total War Attila, and there's an army, and I'm chasing down this army, or I'm taking out this nation, and this nation is stronger than me, or whatever, and I'm fighting, and I get to that one army. That battle is narratively identical to a boss fight, right? But it feels the same as a boss fight, and mechanically it's a boss fight because I'm taking on this army that's bigger than me, that's more powerful than me, that I've been working my way up, and I know that if I can just take this army and crack it over my knee, I can subjugate this whole nation and just run rampant. All of that stuff is identical to boss fights, but it would feel awkward to label that a boss fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's like saying, it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it has a bill and feathers and swims in a lake, but it's actually a swan.
And I think my point was going to be is that these kind of labeled boss fight experiences are maybe not becoming less common is the way I want to put it, but they're for a lot of, I think they are becoming less common for some things. I think they're being sublimated into kind of in favor of less jarring experiences, and as these different genres that we enjoy kind of either rise to prominence in the community or rise to prominence in at least our own play habits, we don't hit as many of these kind of individual kind of one shot. I think one of the most legendary bosses of all time, especially if you talk to our friends over at the Unwise Index about it, is Gil from Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. I don't know. I assume that you're not familiar with him.
100%. No, I've never heard that name in my life.
He's the end boss, and he's super hard. He's near impossible to beat. It took, even there's a version available for I got a version for I think base Xbox they played on my Xbox 360. That's just it's super tough. Like he's a super good fighter. In the great tradition of fighting game bosses, he's a super broken character that you can't play.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
But like you knock him down and he gets another full fucking health bar, and you're like, what the goddamn hell is this bullshit? And it's just super tough. But it's even though some like that kind of moment when he refills his health, you're like, fuck, I have to do this all again. It still feels so satisfying that you've managed to get through his mechanics and beat him. And I think that's the thing that we're losing in the modern age as games specialize more. And sometimes it's a good thing, right? Like there's no boss fights in Street Fighter V. That's and there might be in June when the single player mode comes out, but it's fine, right? Like I'd much rather those development hours go into making a more refined multiplayer experience, because that's ultimately the staying power of that game. Like I don't think games like Call of Duty have boss fights. Like older first person shooters had like Mecha Hitler or whatever to like we say Wolfenstein as boss fights. But those like in the modern age, it's less about these specialized types of enemies and more about like set pieces that kind of go along with it. I guess that's become kind of the modern fair. Boss fight are these, as you were saying, these fights that break out against a bunch of giant things, or like these big set pieces in your modern AAA shooters or the like.
Yeah, I feel that. I also think that those set piece battles, like StarCraft is a lot like that. Like they're the like those set piece battles feel like boss fights, but they are, maybe boss fights are like a subgenre of like set pieces in.
Sure. Yeah, that makes
games.
sense.
I think that's a pretty fair label overall. I'm really trying to think. Something I was thinking about is like, what's my favorite? Like, what are the most famous boss fights? What's my favorite boss fight of all time? And I've kind of come to realize that I don't really think I've really played all that many of these games, or I don't necessarily think the boss fights are all that great for like these legendary ones, right? Like I never played Final Fantasy VII, so I never got the Sephiroth. The Sephiroth boss fight. I don't know. Maybe, some of the other ones I'm thinking of. Oh man, I just had it a second ago. What was it? In Halo 2, there was the boss fight. The Gravemind or whatever.
Yeah, I never got that far. Am I
remembering that correctly? Like that was a pretty, that was like a pretty big deal from like a boss fight perspective.
You just reminded me of one of my most aggravating moments in gaming. I was actually going to kind of lead into this is like bosses that cheat infuriate me to no end. When you mentioned Sephiroth, one of my favorite games of all time is Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Amazing kind of it's a JRPG, but it's also it's a tactical JRPG, which means there's a grid, you can move around. I feel like it really does a lot to kind of get around the problems of like you just have like you can just kind of roll up more numbers, but you can also significantly get around that by clever tactical play, which I think lacks in a lot of kind of lineup style JRPGs. And one of the systems in that game is there these things there are these this system called the law system, where every day it would randomize new rules that you had to apply to combat. Like you couldn't cast fire spells, or you couldn't do certain actions. And these re-randomize every day. And if you were fighting, as long as you weren't fighting in kind of like there's specific fights that are outside the law, and if your character dies during that, it's permanently dead. But if you die or if you faint rather inside of a regular mission, you can be recovered and you're just sick for a while. But one of the rules they're random on right before a big story mission was you can't attack. And I was like, oh man, this boss fight, which I've tried a couple different times, will be super easy because if you break the rules enough times, the judge will give you a red card and throw you out of the fight and bring you to jail, essentially. It's like soccer. You get yellow cards and red cards for using the wrong systems.
Okay.
And so I go in this fight and I'm like, oh man, I'm going to cheese my way through this fight. And he comes over and he attacks me and he gets the yellow card. I'm like, yes, all right. And then he keeps attacking me and the judge refuses to give him a red card. And I was so mad that I couldn't like the rules apparently didn't apply to this boss character. It's just that was a terrible experience for me, and just kind of like, you know, there are bosses that kind of what called reading inputs, like read what your controller's doing and just counters it anyway. Oh man, that kind of crap aggravates me to no end.
Yeah, man. Now that you mentioned that, would bug me. That would bug me a lot. I would get really stressed out, I think. Yeah, that would really bug me.
Yeah, but that's my memorable boss fight. You know, endless frustration and a trail of tears.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what the most like memorable boss fight I've ever done is. I just like I really feel like I'm kind of coming up with blanks.
Oh, this is something I wanted to bring up. Something I did play relatively recently is Bloodborne. And by relatively recently, I mean like November of last year, 2014.
So 5 months ago.
No, longer than that, like 17 months ago.
Oh my god! Holy shit.
But I thought that those boss fights were incredibly difficult, and in some ways infuriating. But it was awesome. Like there's this one of the first boss is like this. I don't even know how to describe it. It's a giant monster, and you're running around. And you're trying to like hit at it while it's jumping around in like in like its boss pattern, and you're scrambling around. But when it goes down, it feels so good. And the second boss is Father Gascoigne. He's a werewolf, and the first half of the fight is just is fighting against a character that is very similar to yours. He's got the same similar weapon, and he's got a gun, and then you get him to about half health, and then he transforms into a werewolf, and everything goes to fucking shit. And I played that fight maybe 100 times as some of our friends sat and watched and made me keep trying, and then eventually I got it, and it was like the greatest thing. It was so so satisfying. I love that kind of feeling. I was as we were going into this episode, I realized I had realized that I'm probably missing a lot of good fodder for this because I want to jump into Bayonetta 1 and 2 soon. And I hear that they've got some pretty incredible boss fights, but I love that kind of like, you know, these kind of like use your tools and, you know, slam your head against the wall until you break through. I just love that kind of experience. I think
those kinds of boss fights are, I think, I really they're definitely really fun. You know, in a terrible way. I don't necessarily think it's good game design. You know what I mean? But like, I wouldn't hold it against anyone if they told me that was.
I don't think it's particularly bad. Like it's a boss. Like I think ultimately all these types of fights demand a certain level of perfection, and if you really dial that perfection dial to like you have very little margin for error. I think that's kind of where you hit this, and there is a frustration point. You can dial it too high, but I think the Bloodborne games hit it well, or the Bloodborne and the Souls games hit it well.
Yeah, I think I agree. Not that I've played the Bloodborne or the Soul games, I hear this, and so I am reporting based on my best understanding, I guess.
I take it you're not going to play Dark Souls 3?
I might get around to it. I just haven't ever. So, you know, maybe I can't really speak. It's something that exists kind of like on a different plane from where I like sit, I guess. Plane of existence.
Yeah,
Not like
that's fair.
I almost said choo-choo plane, like choo-choo train. Maybe that's maybe that's the sign that that we've been podcasting too long. I'm a little out of it. As we come to the end of it.
Yeah, you
plane. That would be awesome.
You were probably thinking of the Thomas the Tank Engine mod for Skyrim.
You're right. I totally was. But yeah,
I think that's about.
I guess I think we've about covered it. It's actually kind of it's interesting to me how different this ended up compared to the other episode on boss fights.
Yeah, the Pathfinder. We've got strong opinions about what's wrong. I don't know. This was a nice kind of meander through the world of video games. I like it.
Yeah, I agree. But I guess this coming week for you guys, as it's coming out, is Wednesday. So tomorrow, from when this comes out, is Hell's Rebels. And then the following Monday would be
Shadowrun. And the
on that schedule.
Yeah.
This rotating schedule is it's real confusing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's what happens when we want to play all the games, but life gets in the way, right?
Yeah, for real.
Anyway, you can email us what you think about video game bosses and what your favorite or least favorites are at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com. That's one Some Derps Play Games. It's not Some Derps Play Games or Derp Play Games at gmail.com. It's just Some Derps Play Games at gmail.com. Link will be in the description. You can watch a stream at twitch.tv/SomeDerpsPlayGames. You can watch, we have a YouTube channel too. Search for it. I'll put a link in the description to that as well. You can reach us on Twitter. Those are going to be in the description. Everything will be in the description. Comment on everything. I read all the comments, all 0 comments. But yeah, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, farewell, everyone.